Okay. Um, Thank you everybody for joining us for this talk about the ethics imperative in digital identity. Why are we here to talk about ethics? Well, I've been working in identity for a long time, and at Unicorn, one of the things that we've been doing is working on an identity platform that is dealing with banking, financial inclusion, national digital identity, financial digital identity, etc. And so I really wanted to dig into ethics because that's something that I run into a lot. And so I really wanted to make sure we had the right brains on this stage because I'm clearly not the right brain. So I have some really great speakers here to join me on stage. So I'll turn it over to them for a quick introduction because if I start introducing them, I'll just keep going on and on.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Eve Mailer. I'm the founder of Venn Factory. We make more than Venn diagrams. We make irresistible identity strategies, former ForgeRock CTO, and big fan of getting things right in identity and surrounding topics.
Yeah, she's being way too subtle. She's the OG of OGs of ID, let's face it. Hello, XML girl, right? No tomatoes. Eve. I'm Michelle Dennedy. I'm the lesser mentee of these two. I'm currently the CEO of a company called Privacy Code and a consultancy called Privatus, and we'll talk about what Publicus is versus your Privatus. And I've been in the privacy and IP protection game for a minute.
Okay, and I'm Nishant Kaushik. I'm the CTO at Unicorn, so I have no credentials compared to the two of them. But I do have a lot of experience in the last few years dealing with ethical quandaries a lot. Because as I mentioned, working in building an identity security platform, I've had a front row seat to a lot of these ethical quandaries that show up when you start dealing with identity at scale. When I pitched this talk to Michelle and Eve, they both were glad to join, which I was excited by. Michelle said she wanted it to be a fireside conversation, so we have fire, which felt appropriate because as I've been dealing with these situations and I've been dealing with other companies or competing with other companies and seeing a lot of this stuff, what I found is that when we start looking at these solutions, I start seeing that we're dealing with ethics in its facets, right? We're dealing with individual aspects of ethics, whether it's privacy, whether it's human-centered design, whether it's inclusion. But we aren't really dealing with it holistically. And that sort of disconnectedness, that's sort of parallelism of responsibilities, if you will, what that is actually doing is actually creating more problems for us that we're not really seeing coming. And that was actually the genesis of the talk I gave last year at Identiverse, where I looked at some of these quandaries that people were dealing with. Fast forward a year, and what I see is that a lot of companies are not talking about building ethical identity solutions. They're using the term ethics a lot. But if you ask them, what does that actually mean? What do you mean when you say you have ethics as part of your product? I get a lot of blank stares from people. I don't really get a lot of details. There's nothing material in there. So there's a lot of ethics washing going on. And while there's a lot of good people working in identity with the right intentions of wanting to make things better, we all know the old adage about the road to hell is paved with. And so that's kind of why this is the feeling I'm getting nowadays, which is, are we okay? I'm not sure. But what gives me hope is having people like Eve and Michelle here to talk about this stuff, because what I've tried to look at is how do we remove that disconnect? And the only way that I've seen it, or at least in reading through ethics, what I've seen is that the disconnect between good intentions and good outcomes comes about when you basically apply careful operationalization. That's a mouthful. And Michelle, you literally wrote the book on privacy engineering, which is all about operationalization and is the keystone to privacy by design, which a lot of us are talking about. So to try and get rid of our friend here, because we don't want that to be our world, and get back into a comfort zone, I'll turn it over to you and have you talk a little bit about this.
All right. So I think the first thing I think you've touched on is a really important one, which is, can ethics be operationalized? And I think we'll debate a little bit about whether that is true, because I have heard recently, and I heard the same thing about privacy. Privacy is like a mood or a religion or a feeling. Like, we got so much feelings. We don't have feelings about security somehow, but we have feelings about things that are internationally regulated, are things that customers demand, are things that cause us to have things like brand, things like HR integrity, things like identity applied well. We're the who in this whole identity world is the privacy implication. So much like privacy that can seem like it's a sort of cultural-based soft science, ethics also has enough structure on it that we can actually approach this with the 3,000 years of ethics practice that we actually do have. And so the way I look at these approaches is, A, declare it. I'm going to take an ethical approach, not do no evil. Anyone here from original Google days? Yeah. How did that go for you? It's a good idea, but it's not instantiated. So if you think about ethics as a zero trust world, my ethics is everything is on fire. It's an ethical approach. How then do I operationalize everything on fire? Is my ethics approach a consequentialist approach? What are the consequences of good and bad decision making as an ethical study? And how do we actually start to backwards engineering consequentialism? Or you can take a deontological approach and say what has been regulated so far, and so good is defined as ethics is the common rule for the common. And so if you believe, and I think this is the wrong approach, and we'll talk about why I think that is, if you take the deontological approach and you say let's start with the laws that exist and operationalize backwards, that being the ethical good for that particular society, that's also an ethical approach, and you simply need to start to declare it.
It's more fun if I disagree, right?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, I partially disagree. I think anything can be operationalized. I think programs are valuable, frameworks are valuable, structures are valuable. As anybody knows from, say, deploying an IAM system, there are competing concerns and constraints. And if you don't look at all the other competing things, which include the actual business model of almost every company on the planet, it's very hard to impose a structure that doesn't have the incentives aligned with all the rest of it. And one of the things I think is missing from the picture that would help to align or help give the transparency that lets you know how far away you are from alignment is what I've just started to think of as a kind of a data value chain. If you could track how everybody in your company and all your partners actually uses any piece of data, I mean, first of all, you'd probably be shocked. Somebody would be pleased. But there'd be no denying it. And then you could start to assign responsibility and liability. And then I think we have a fighting chance of behaving up to the standards that we claim we have. That's some thoughts.
I'm gonna disagree that you're disagreeing.
Meta disagreement.
It's a meta disagreement because I actually think you're taking a consequentialist approach. So I think if you have a good data model, and we should have good data models, that's exactly what a good data model does. Why are you collecting this information about a certain business process? What is the quality of the decision criteria and elements of this data? Who is allowed to make, there's that who. How do we know who's who in the zoo? Identity verse. Hello, huzzah, you can cheer for that. Woo. How do we do that? So if you have a good data model and you have a good sense of data quality and you understand, as you must, your raison d'etre, why are you there? Yes, to make money. But if your goal is EBITDA, you're going to fail because you're going to forget about all these other competing things. Because Sally down the hall's goal is getting out of work on time on Friday to get on vacation. So she's taking shortcuts. She's not thinking EBITDA in every decision making that she's making. So you have to make it as systematic as possible for as many people as possible to make the right data decisions as possible to get to a consequentialist outcome.
So one of the things you brought up there is this thing that I constantly see playing out in identity, which is the concept of ethical fading, right? Which is the idea, as you said, that everybody's starting with the right idea, and they want to do the right things, but they have these other priorities, and those priorities end up taking center stage and pushing ethics off stage, right? And that happens over and over again, not least because of the fact that because identity is playing a role as both the security side but also the business enabler side, you have this constant tension that kind of forces you to make choices, right? And it's interesting that you said work backwards from sort of the laws, because a lot of times that's actually the thing that's causing the issues. Absolutely. In many cases, especially what I'm dealing with, where I'm dealing with financial inclusion, and a lot of it in financial inclusion has to do with very sensitive data getting collected and centralized in systems. And I'm not here to make a pitch for decentralization. That is not at all what I'm bringing up here. What I am bringing up is that, yes, you can bring in transparency, which is essentially what you're saying. Collect the data, make sure that there's transparency of what data is getting collected, how it's being done, and accountability, which is about who and why. But then, at the end of the day, you still end up with these weird decision points. And what I find with regulation, I'll give a good example. This is something that everybody will correlate with. In trying to basically provide our solution for a project that was dealing with national identity, one of the things we ran into was the fact that a lot of national identity projects are leveraging a platform called MOSIP. If you were at Identiverse, you've seen MOSIP talked about. And it is a wonderful idea. It is a wonderful concept. I have zero problems with the concept behind the idea of an open source identity platform for national identity that is being adopted by countries that would not have the ability or the resources to build their own system the way India was able to stand up Aadhaar. But one of the, I don't know if it would be an ethical choices, but one of the decisions that was made in that project was, if you're going to use biometrics, because you're doing national scale stuff, we don't want to have vendor lock-in. Because we don't want to have vendor lock-in, the biometrics have to be stored in raw form. Oh boy. As in raw images, because we have to be able to switch the provider at any point in time. And this fundamentally became a problem for us because we had a privacy by design approach of saying privacy first, only store what is needed. So we store the template and get rid of the photograph, right? We never store the photograph it's derived from. So we can't play in that ecosystem. We recently rolled out something called Palm-Wind Biometrics, which from a privacy perspective is actually one of the best, from the fairness perspective is actually one of the best biometrics, because it's private, it's secure, it doesn't have a lot of bias because it's not dealing with skin color or shape of hand or stuff. Like, yeah, it's biased against kids, but that's basically the only thing. But we couldn't do that as well because there was no raw image that we collect in the first place. It is immediately at the hardware level converted into a template. So we couldn't satisfy the regulatory requirement, which was you must support switching. So laws oftentimes actually ends up becoming a big challenge for us when we're trying to do things in a privacy-centric fashion, right? And these are some of the ethical quandaries that we keep running into all the time.
Yeah, there's two quick comments. One is, I think this is why I like the consequentialist versus following a I'm not going to say it anymore, the legal approach, with the deontological approach. We all know that the law is behind our society, and it's far behind our technology. And it's way behind our morality. Has anyone been to DC lately? It's a hot mess. We don't necessarily want to follow that as our moral good. Now, it is our law, so it is a central ethical course, but it has a moral crust that's a little bit thin. So if you take a more consequential, so I won't wax prolific about why following something that might be outdated. And remember, slavery was once legal. And this is the same discussion to have in AI. So if your AI faithfully told you what I should get paid 20% less than any white man in this room. Because that's the fact. That's what the data says. Is that right? No. Some of y'all, but some of y'all, I should get paid a lot more. I'm just saying. And then the second point is, I'm sorry that I can't remember her name, but the paper for this one woman's PhD doctorate defense was called Moral Crumple Zones. And it's a wonderful concept. So we use geometry in cars so that when there is a crash that is anticipated, you're pulling out, you're backing in, you're getting a side swipe because of the way traffic lights are configured, they actually have pushed the energy into open pockets in the vehicle that are away from the passenger. So you'll see now horribly crippled cars, and people are bopping out of them, and it's not just the airbag, it's because they've built in a crumple zone. So when we build in a moral crumple zone, or an ethical crumple zone, exactly as you say, we've got something that on the books is incorrect or doesn't work to function to actually, or creates bias or unfairness. And so you have to create an ethical engineering system around the broken core. And there's not a lot of good answers in your case when it's a procurement situation.
Quick comment about kind of ethics versus all the other things that it's sort of lumped in with. One of the trends that I like, and in the spirit of transparency, I will disclose, I'm on the board of an organization called Internet Safety Labs, and they've conceived of online product safety. I think they were really first to sort of put things in play that aren't, it's not just about security, it's not just about privacy, and it is a very deep kind of ethics to be concerned about, technology that might be unsafe at any speed, as we used to say about a certain car. So when you conceive of it as safety, you start to look at really kind of population level effects that wouldn't have been obvious otherwise. We've been learning about things like social media and what it does to kids. And after the fact, we need some sort of way to say, well, nobody's too big to fail. And I've gotten a much greater appreciation for transparency versus control mechanisms. Control mechanisms are great. I'm a big fan of permissions, of people autonomously getting to say what their preferences are. But I'm starting to think that transparency comes first, because with transparency comes the ability to shame, the ability for third parties to observe things and report on them. And it kind of creates a fertile ground for better autonomous control.
Well, this is the reason the California breach law was passed, is we actually sat in a dark room in Sacramento late one night over pizza, and it was a debate, because what they wanted was strict liability anytime any company had a breach. And yet in 2002, how many security people had even close to the right budget? They still don't today, but even back then. And so we said, at the time, we thought, well, what GE could afford any fine? They're huge, they could outspend. And it was Microsoft at the time was like the big behemoth. HP could spend whatever astronomical figure, but they couldn't outspend shame. And that's why the breach disclosure and the safe harbor of what we said initially was controls, protections, and obfuscations, which turned into encryption as a magic bunny. But it is what it is, and at least we sort of forced people into a mode where you either had to tell that you hadn't protected the data at all, or you got rewarded because you had used some sort of a technique to at least make that data less helpful or less accessible to a bad guy. But shame.
So I don't know how to operationalize shame, but maybe that's the right transition.
We do.
To
some companies seem shameless. I'm sorry to say.
We perfected it.
But
there's a currency behind shame.
There is.
Currency behind shame. Oh, nice.
Yeah.
so in that vein, like one of the things I was I discovered, like the idea that came to me last year when I was preparing my talk, which became obvious when I started looking around and seeing that other people were doing the same thing. So it's not by any means an original idea, is the concept of an ethical, applied ethics tool, right? And I started just looking for what is the applied ethics tool that can be applied for digital identity. And I didn't find one, right? There's ones in other areas. It's interesting to note that with AI emerging over the last few years, there's been over 100 set of principles that have been released by different organizations. And there's no uniformity. They all talk about it without clarifying how to actually use it. By contrast, for example, in biomedical ethics, there's been one set of ethical principles for over 40 years that they all apply by. So it clearly can be done, right? And so the question is, how do we get to the point where with everything that we're doing in identity, how do we create an applied ethics tool for digital identity? Because I don't know that an ethics governance board is necessarily the answer for organizations, because most organizations can't afford to have one, especially in identity, because there's so many startups and new ones show up every year. It's never going to happen. Big companies can get to do it. Certifications are interesting, but they often end up being gatekeepers and cost barriers to entry. Regulations is very much suffering some of the similar issues, where either the regulation is too broad, so it's really easy to skirt it, or it's too specific and narrow, and then you get penalized, right? So that's kind of what I'm looking at, again, from the experience that both of you have in dealing with this, especially with some of the larger customers as well as in the privacy space. How do you see we can go about, with the people in this room, building an applied ethics tool for identity, for digital identity?
I'm going to say if you want to.
We're like Sonny and Cher.
I got you, babe. I'm dubious, I have to say, about coming up with an absolute set of principles that can then be applied without question, because the example you gave was so evocative of how those corner cases need to be dealt with by humans with humbleness and transparency. And so if they're absolute guidelines, they're going to get us into trouble the same way that absolute regulations keep getting us into trouble. Maybe some of Kim Cameron's laws of identity might make for good ethical principles, and there's others. But I've collected like FIPS and privacy by design principles. There's a lot of those, and they all align pretty well, but they're all pretty squishy. They're all very qualitative. So to make harder edges, you have to have technology, and then you don't want to be beholden to the technology. So
yeah, I think that's right. I think it can be done with squishiness. So I think, and the squishiness is not satisfying, but I think the other barrier, particularly for ethics, and part of the reason, when my dad and I set out to write the Privacy Engineers Manifesto, there were privacy by design principles, but there wasn't any way of applying it. It was like, that's the goal. It was very policy driven, but he was a systems engineering and security guy. I'm an IP lawyer. So when I would call home, when I was at Sun with this lovely lady, I would be like, Dad, are they putting me on? Like, is this system? We came together and said legal and engineering people actually are kind of speaking a use case and specification language that can be documented, maybe not perfectly, but you have plans, you have specs, you have requirements, you have outcomes, you have quality, and then I went deep into what does it mean to be an engineer? And in the early days of engineering, first you couldn't get a degree in engineering unless it was specifically ceramics or mechanical or agricultural. But when you became an electrical engineer, and before computer science came, you were a professional engineer. And one of the criteria, in addition to having someone like a legal practice, you'd have a mentor and you'd have time, you would sign on to a code of ethics.
That's the key. Maybe we need to go through ID Pro and have it be part of a code of how people practice identity and be bound by it as a kind of a brother and sisterhood who do the right thing.
Yep, and obviously Women in Identity is definitely working on this with their code of conduct, which is an incredible start. But I think anybody in the room who is interested in this topic needs to support them more on that project because they definitely need a lot of help. And it is a good start, but it definitely, like I said, we're dealing with this problem in facets. We're not really having a holistic solution right now, right? Last year I talked about small measures, right? So the small measure I was thinking of that I had introduced was the concept of, as a principle, let's start applying value-sensitive design as part of building digital identity projects and start incorporating that. And what I found in the work that I was doing, that it really helped in some cases for me to be able to say no. Like, it helped me turn around and say, no, and here's why. And when I could explain the why, I got the buy-in from my exec, right? So that was a really important thing. And so I'm going to end with the line that actually came, because we're running really short on time. We could have gone on for hours. What I tried to do is I've put together a page where we've put together a bunch of resources, and it's a list of resources that keep growing. You can, I'll post this on LinkedIn afterwards as well. But we're going to keep providing resources on this topic to grow the discussion. We want to definitely continue it. I said last year I want Heather Flanagan working on this at ID Pro, because if she takes it on, it's going to get done, right? It's going to get done. So the point is, what I wanted to close on, yesterday Tucker Bryant had this line that really resonated with me because it just hit me really hard in terms of what I was dealing with, which is he said, in poetry, every single word is a decision, including which words not to use. Yes. And that really resonated in the discussion we're having today. So our tech is a reflection of our humanity, and I hope that all of us who are working on this tech brings their humanity to this. I think we have an incredible community here. We need, it's going to sound sucky to say this, because we need more Jonathan Sanders working in identity, because we need more philosophers. And philosophy is at the heart of building ethical solutions, because they deal with the uncomfortable truths. And we need more poets. We need more poets, and we need more philosophers.
Justin Richer is one.
There you go. So all right, maybe that's why it's so good. So with that, thank you very much. We hope this conversation can continue. This is definitely not the end of it. And thank you very much.
Thanks to Nishant.